When you were in high school, did you have a football hero in your high school? Yes. Did you have that person that everybody just adored because they were good at football? In my high school, the young man was named Fred. Fred was just a natural athlete. One thing I like about Fred that I remember about him was that he didn't have that attitude, though, because he was gifted in sports. Fred was a kind person also, too, but he was all that. He was our football hero. And he managed to take that natural ability and actually find himself at one point in the National Football League. Fred was our football hero. Notice, though, I didn't say that Fred was our best athlete. Did any of you in high school have a wrestling team? Now, those are athletes. Those are athletes. These are people that get no glory whatsoever, and they beat themselves to death to make weight, to be strong enough, and then they go out. And I always remember I knew my wrestlers in high school because they were the kids in my class with mat burns on their face. They ran steps. Wrestling is hard stuff. And you have to work hard at it. And of course, wrestling is different from, going back to Fred for a moment. I think in high school, Fred was about 6'6" and probably weighed around 280 and was all muscle. In wrestling, you can start at 98 pounds and work your way all up to what they call heavyweight. So it's for people of all different sizes, but you have to work in order to be a wrestler. Wrestling is tough stuff. Jacob, remember Jacob? You know what he was a natural at? Being a conniving creep. Jacob underdid his brother. He tricked his dad. He got involved in having these relationships that made things messy. And Jacob was a bit of a problem. Now, if we remember, Jacob last week had found a woman that he loved named Rachel, but in order in that culture for him to marry Rachel, he also had to marry Rachel's sister. And he didn't really have feelings for her, but he had to marry her anyhow. So anyhow, now we're going to fast forward, and let's say Jacob's been busy, because he's got 11 kids now, 11 sons. And so we pick up in Genesis chapter 32 with this part of Jacob's life. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, his 11 sons, and crossed the ford at the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions, so that Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What's your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" But he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, which means a place where he had saw God face to face, yet his life was spared. And the sun rose above as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Jacob had wrestled with God. Have any of you ever wrestled with God? With questions? With concerns? With anxiety? With heartbreak? I believe most of us have wrestled at some point with God. And if you notice with Jacob, in order for him to wrestle with God, in order for us to wrestle with God, we need to put everything aside. We need to put everything aside. Jacob left all his stuff on the other side. His wives, his servants, his kids, his stuff, his property, everything. He left it on the other side and went to be alone. Sometimes, in order to truly wrestle with God, we need to do it alone. Alone. Now, I'm going to get through this surgery tomorrow. It's not going to be that big of a deal. You know what really bums me out? Actually, next week, I was going to be going to the monastery and spending a time alone with God for a week. And I needed that because really since last November, the model that I learned at some point in my life is we need to spend a week with God a year, a day with God every month, and an hour with God every day. And I found in my life when I do that, it helps in so many ways. And I also found really since like last November, because of some of the challenges we've had at church, that I've let go of some of that. And I've paid for it. I paid for it. It's so important sometimes for us, if we're going to wrestle with God, to put our stuff aside, to put everything aside and go and be alone with him. One of my favorite writers from the 20th century, Christian writers, was a man by the name of Henry Nouwen. Henry Nouwen was a Catholic priest. He was a great writer, a great teacher. In fact, a classmate of Dennis's at one time when Dennis was taking clinical pastoral education. And Nouwen wrote this, and it was in a devotion that I got to look at this week. He says, "Somewhere we know that without silence, words lose their meaning. That without listening, speaking no longer heals. That without distance, closeness cannot cure. Somewhere we need to know without a lonely place, our actions quickly become empty gestures. The careful balance between silence and words, withdrawal and involvement, distance and closeness, solitude and community forms the basis of the Christian life, and should therefore be the subject of our most personal attention." Now it invites us, and remember, Jesus withdrew. Jesus invites us that there are times that we need to withdraw and go away and wrestle with God. In order to wrestle with God, you need to hang in there. You need to hang in there. Jacob hung in there. It must have been hard. It must have been tiring. It must have been grueling. But Jacob hung in there just the same. How many times? Me too. How many times have we given up early? You know, we say a prayer, say, "God, make this happen for us." And when it doesn't happen, we say, "Okay, that didn't work. I won't say it anymore." But yet, there's something of a blessing to being able to hang on with God. Because when we hang on with God sometimes, as you see with Jacob, Jacob turned out having a life much different from the life he thought he was going to have. Because he hung in there. I think I've shared this with you this morning. Your pastor shouldn't be your pastor. If I had my way when I was a young man, I would be a corporate attorney making a lot of money. How thankful I am that God hung in there with me and I hung in there with God. We hang in with God, and for you, there's so many things that you have had great purpose because you hung in there with God. See, God doesn't always give us what we want. God gives us what we're supposed to have. And sometimes that takes wrestling. Sometimes it takes wrestling. In order to wrestle with God, we must be willing to change. We must be willing to change. Jacob, this conniving little creep, wrestled with God and his name changed. His name changed to Israel, and we're very familiar with the nation of Israel. Israel means one who struggles with God. And I want you to think this day about present-day Israel still struggles with God. And their insecurities that they've put up walls of separation between God's people. I've seen it and it breaks my heart. They still struggle. The people of Israel do. For a way that is God's way. A way that honors the lives of all people. And they remember that they are blessed for one reason, to be a blessing to others. In order to wrestle with God, we must be willing to think of falling forward and thinking about the scars we have in our life. The scars we have in our life. Particularly for some of us, we carry physical scars, and we've kind of learned in a way to live with those. What are tough are the emotional scars. The emotional scars. And that's why it's important sometimes to stop and to wrestle with your emotional scars. And at some point be thankful for the grace that comes to us in Jesus Christ. I'm going to give you your homework now so you can start to work on it. Your homework this week is to wrestle. I don't expect you out in the hallways rolling around. But to wrestle with God, with your stuff, to put your stuff aside so it can be just you and him. Remember these high school wrestlers, if you're the football hero, you're on a football team. Well, high school wrestlers supposedly are on a football team, or a wrestling team, but at the end of the day, it's one-on-one. They have no equipment other than something to cover their ears so their ears don't get hurt. Other than that, it's one-on-one against their adversary. God is calling us sometimes to face our adversaries one-on-one and to let him help us to wrestle, to give us the strength we need for the days, months, and years that lie ahead. Amen.